Hey everyone, welcome back. We all take assessments, personality tests, those quizzes you see online, even evaluations in school. But have you ever thought about how those are designed? The good ones and the bad ones? We're diving into that today.
Assessments are everywhere these days.
They really are. So to help us navigate this, we've got a fascinating source. It's a university course
Yeah.
all about psychodiagnostics.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, right.
Hmm.
It basically means the study of assessment.
Mhm.
And we're going to uncover some pretty surprising things, like common mistakes that even the pros make, like
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
experts, and guidelines for doing it right, plus why this matters for all of us, not just like psychology folks.
This stuff affects everyone.
Seriously. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, so our source material kicks off by saying assessment, it's bigger than just here's a test, what's your score? It's about like gathering solid info to make good decisions.
Right. And those decisions, they're not just, theoretical. They have real impact.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about it. Assessments, they can determine things like where kids go to school, who gets a job, even legal cases.
No kidding. So the stakes are super high, which makes it even more important to get it right.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's talk about some of the traps, right?
The pitfalls.
Yeah, the pitfalls.
Yeah.
Like our source material, it lists 10 common fallacies, almost like brain traps that can mess up even really careful assessments. And the first one, it's called mismatched validity.
Oh, that's a good one.
Sounds technical, right?
It does.
But I think it's something we can all wrap our heads around.
For sure. It's like, imagine you're trying to, I don't know, measure like how tall you are using a kitchen scale.
That's not going to work.
Right.
You need a tape measure for that.
Exactly. The scale, it's a great tool, but for weight, not height.
Right, right. So using the wrong tool for the job, that's mismatched validity.
Yeah, basically.
Mm.
So when it comes to these assessments, mismatched validity, it means you're using a test that, well, it wasn't designed to measure what you're actually trying to assess. Like, let's say you try to evaluate adults using a test meant for little kids.
Oh, that's funny.
The results, they wouldn't make any sense.
That's a great way to put it. You've got to use the right tool for the job. Simple as that.
Simple as that.
Okay. Next trap, confirmation bias.
Ooh, a classic.
I've heard of this one, but how does it play out in like assessments specifically?
Well, confirmation bias, it's something we all do, whether we realize it or not.
Oh, for sure.
We tend to look for info that confirms what we already believe, and then we ignore stuff that doesn't fit.
So it's like wearing those rose-colored glasses.
Exactly. And in assessments, that can be a huge problem. It can lead to biased interpretation. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
let's say you go into an assessment thinking someone's going to do poorly. You might, like, subconsciously focus on their weaknesses and miss their strengths, just because you already had that idea in your head.
It's like we're filtering info to fit our own stories. That's a really good point. We need to be aware of our own biases so they don't mess things up.
Definitely.
All right, this next one sounds like it's straight out of statistics class. Low base rates.
Ooh, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty.
Tell me about it.
Okay, so low base rates, they can lead to some really weird results, and our source uses a great example for this. Imagine you're trying to find, like, dishonest judges, and let's say only 1 in 500 judges is actually dishonest.
Okay.
Now, even if you have a test that's 90% accurate,
Wow, that's pretty accurate.
right, you're still going to end up with a ton of false positives. That means you'll flag a bunch of honest judges as dishonest.
Wait, what? How is that possible? If the test is 90% accurate.
It's all about the math. Because dishonest judges, they're so rare. Even a small percentage of errors, it means a lot of honest judges get misidentified. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. Even if your metal detector is good, you're going to pick up a lot of hay along the way.
That is mind-blowing. I never thought of it that way. It's like,
Ugh.
wow, statistics can be so tricky, and it's really important to understand the base rates of what you're trying to find.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered 3 fallacies so far: mismatched validity, confirmation bias, low base rates.
Each one's its own little trap.
Yeah.
They can really distort those assessment results.
So, what other fallacies should we be looking out for?
Well, there's this one, confusing retrospective and predictive accuracy, and it's all about the direction of our thinking. Like, we might be able to explain someone's past behavior based on the assessment, but that doesn't mean we can predict what they'll do in the future.
Oh, interesting. So just because we can kind of look back and make sense of things doesn't mean we can see into the future.
Right. And then, there's standardized tests, which is basically messing up the procedure. Even small changes to how you give or score a test can totally invalidate the results.
So it's like baking a cake. If you don't follow the recipe exactly, the measurements, the oven temp, you might end up with a disaster instead of a delicious treat.
Precisely. And there are, several others. Each one has its own unique way of, well, potentially skewing the whole assessment process.
It's amazing, really, how many things can go wrong, even with the best intentions. It's like you said, navigating a minefield. We have to be super careful and aware. So, knowing all this, how do we make sure assessments are done ethically? I mean, what are the safeguards to help us avoid these traps and ensure the process is fair and accurate?
Well, that's a great question. And it leads us to the rule book for ethical assessment,
I like it, the rule book.
the APA Ethics Code. Our source material really delves into this, and it's pretty fascinating.
Okay, so this code, it's like the ethical compass for psychologists.
That's a good way to put it. It outlines 6 core ethical principles. They're like the foundation of everything.
6 principles, that's a lot. Um, can you give us a quick rundown of what they are and how they play out in, real-life situations?
Definitely. So first up is competence. Psychologists have got to stick to what they know, and they got to keep learning new stuff, keep their skills sharp. Like, imagine a doctor who's a heart specialist.
Cardiologist.
Yeah, cardiologist. You wouldn't want them doing brain surgery,
No
right?
way.
Same with psychology. Things change. Staying up to date is super important.
Makes sense. So competence is about, like, knowing your stuff and staying current. What's next?
Next is integrity.
Okay.
Being honest and transparent in everything you do. No fudging numbers, no hiding bad results.
That builds trust, right?
For sure, both with the person being assessed and the field as a whole. We all got to rely on each other's work. And speaking of trust, another key principle is professional and scientific responsibility.
Okay, so this is about upholding those professional standards.
Precisely. Using evidence-based practices, staying current on the research, being accountable, it's about taking our roles seriously and contributing, to the advancement of the field.
It's like being a good steward of the profession, making sure you represent it well and keep it credible.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, focusing on the folks involved in those assessments, the APA code really stresses respecting people's rights and dignity.
That sounds pretty fundamental.
It is, recognizing that everyone has inherent worth, treating people fairly, protecting their rights throughout the process.
Okay, so respect for rights and dignity, ensuring everyone's treated ethically. What about their well-being? Does the code address that too?
Absolutely. That's the 5th principle, concern for others' welfare. It's about putting the client's best interest first, minimizing any potential harm.
So you got to weigh the need for the assessment against its impact on the person.
Exactly. Thinking about the benefits, the risks, making sure you're not causing undue stress or harm. It's like a doctor weighing the pros and cons of a treatment.
You don't want the cure to be worse than the disease.
Exactly. And finally, we've got social responsibility. This encourages psychologists to use their knowledge to make the world a better place.
So, using your expertise for the greater good.
That's it. It's about looking beyond the individual case and thinking about the bigger picture.
That's quite a comprehensive set of principles. The APA Ethics Code really sets a high bar for ethical practice. But how do these general principles translate into specific rules for doing those assessments?
Great question. The code also has ethical standards that cover different parts of a psychologist's work, including assessment.
So it's like zooming in from those broad principles and seeing how they play out in the day-to-day, right?
Exactly. For example, there's a whole section on evaluation, assessment, or intervention that lays out specific expectations.
Like what?
Well, it covers things like using tests correctly, knowing their limitations, getting informed consent, keeping things confidential, explaining the results clearly. It's all about ensuring the whole process is fair, respectful, and protects people's well-being.
Sounds like a checklist for ethical assessment.
You could say that. It's a guide to doing things the right way.
And then there's another layer of standards, right? Specifically for educational and psychological tests.
You got it. These standards go even deeper. They cover everything from the technical aspects, like how reliable the test is, to the professional guidelines for using them in different settings.
It's like making sure every part of that cake recipe is perfect.
Absolutely.
So we've got the groundwork laid, the principles, the standards that guide ethical assessment. But let's get real. What are some of the biggest ethical issues that come up in practice?
Our source material highlights 3 key areas: informed consent, confidentiality, and invasion of privacy.
Whoa, those are big ones. Let's start with informed consent. What does that really mean when we're talking about assessments? It's more than just signing a form, right?
For sure. It's about making sure the person being assessed understands what they're agreeing to, and they're doing it willingly. They need to know why they're being assessed, how the results will be used, any risks or benefits.
So it's about transparency and giving them the power to choose. Right.
Absolutely. And this can get kind of tricky in real-world scenarios, like what happens if the assessment uncovers something unexpected, something the person wasn't prepared for? Or what about situations where those results need to be shared with, like employers or schools?
Those are really good points. You have to balance the need for information with the person's right to know and make their own decisions.
Exactly. Informed consent is a conversation that continues throughout the process.
Gotcha. So informed consent is about making sure the individual is truly on board. Now, what about confidentiality? That seems crucial for trust.
It is. Confidentiality is essential for building a safe and trusting environment. It allows people to feel comfortable opening up and being honest.
But I'm guessing there are exceptions.
Right. Sometimes psychologists are legally obligated to disclose information.
Like when?
Think about mandatory reporting situations, like child abuse, elder abuse, threats of harm. Those cases, the potential harm outweighs the need for secrecy.
It's like the break glass in case of emergency situations.
Right, exactly. You wouldn't hesitate to do what's necessary to protect someone, even if it means breaking the rules.
Makes sense. Are there other exceptions?
Well, there are times when clients agree to share information, like for insurance purposes or for getting accommodations at school.
So even when sharing is necessary, it's got to be done ethically.
Absolutely. You only share what's absolutely necessary.
Okay, so informed consent, confidentiality, and the last one, invasion of privacy. That one feels really sensitive, especially now with all the data collection and online stuff.
It's definitely something to be mindful of.
I mean, imagine taking a personality test and it digs up secrets you want to keep hidden. That's got to feel intrusive,
You can, and that's why being upfront and transparent is so important. Our source uses personality tests as an example because some of the questions, they can get pretty personal.
Oh, yeah.
So the assessor needs to explain why those questions are being asked and how the info will be used.
So how do you balance the need for a thorough assessment, like for a really important job, with someone's right to privacy?
It's a balancing act for sure. You have to be upfront about what you're measuring, get that informed consent, and use the least intrusive method possible.
So you're gathering the info you need, but the person still feels respected.
Exactly. We can't forget that the people we assess, they're not just data points. They're real people with real feelings.
We have to treat them with dignity, even when we're, collecting data about them. It's like the golden rule of assessment. Treat others the way you'd want to be treated if you were being assessed.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This deep dive, it's really opened my eyes to the nuances of ethical assessment. It's so much more than just giving tests and scoring them.
It's about understanding the whole person.
Absolutely. Their background, their strengths, their challenges, and approaching the process with sensitivity and respect, understanding the potential impact it can have on their lives.
Couldn't agree more. It's about the human element.
Now, thinking about real-world situations, how do things like cultural differences or disabilities influence these ethical considerations?
Those are excellent questions, and they highlight how important it is to consider each person's unique context. Let's start with cultural differences.
Okay.
It's pretty obvious that a test developed for one culture might not work in another. It's not just about translating the words.
Right.
You have to get the nuances, the cultural context that shapes how people think and answer those questions.
What might be normal in one culture could be like totally different in another.
Exactly. And that's where specialized expertise in, cross-cultural assessment comes in. It's not just about being sensitive to different cultures. It's about truly understanding how culture influences our thoughts and behaviors.
You need the right tools that have been adapted and validated for that specific group.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you risk misinterpreting those results and, well, potentially causing harm.
Cultural sensitivity is key. What about individuals with disabilities? How do we make sure those assessments are accessible and fair?
Another crucial area. We have to make sure that everyone has an equal chance to show what they can do and that the assessment doesn't create any unnecessary roadblocks.
It's about leveling the playing field and removing obstacles so that everyone can, shine.
That's the goal. This might involve making accommodations, giving extra time, using different formats, or even different assessments altogether.
It's about finding the best way to assess each person, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all.
Precisely. And that takes a deep understanding of the individual's strengths, challenges, and needs.
So you're working with them to make the assessment fair and meaningful.
Exactly.
I'm really starting to see how much ethics is woven into every single part of this process.
It's inseparable.
It's not just about the tests, it's about the people, the context, and the impact our decisions can have. And speaking of impact, we can't ignore technology. It's changing everything.
It's a game changer for sure.
What are your thoughts on these online assessments and AI being used to score tests?
It's exciting and, well, a little daunting. There's huge potential, but also challenges. Online assessments can be great for access,
Yeah.
people in remote areas, more flexible scheduling. And AI, it can make scoring more efficient and potentially reduce human bias. But we got to be careful.
Careful how.
Well, first, those online assessments, they still have to be good, reliable, and valid. Just because it's online doesn't make it a good test.
Right, the same standards apply.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of data security. We're talking about sensitive info, and we got to protect it.
Data breaches are a big deal these days.
No kidding. And with AI, there's the potential for algorithmic bias. If the data used to train the AI is biased, the AI will be biased too.
So it's not just about the tech itself, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. We have to be thoughtful, prioritize fairness and accuracy, and always respect the individual.
Sounds like a balancing act, embracing the benefits while being mindful of the risks.
That's it in a nutshell.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've covered so much: common mistakes, ethical guidelines, the role of technology, cultural sensitivity, and inclusion.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. But before we wrap up, I want to shift gears a bit. I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of ethical assessment. What trends and challenges do you see on the horizon?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is simply keeping up with technology. New tools, new approaches, they're popping up all the time. It can be hard to predict the ethical implications.
This is like trying to hit a moving target,
Exactly. We need ethical guidelines that can adapt.
like an ethical GPS.
I like that. And we also need more collaboration. Assessors, researchers, policymakers, and the people being assessed, we all need to work together.
It's about open communication.
Exactly. We have to be willing to learn from each other and adapt as we go.
It sounds like the future of ethical assessment hinges on our ability to stay ahead of the curve and engage in ongoing dialogue.
That's it in a nutshell.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how complex and nuanced ethical assessment is.
It's a fascinating field.
It is. And before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about how technology impacts assessment, but what about the other way around?
Interesting.
How do our ethical choices in assessment influence the way technology develops, especially AI and data collection?
That's a great point.
It's a two-way street, right? The decisions we make today will have a ripple effect far into the future. Ethical considerations need to be front and center, not just in assessments, but in everything we do.
Perhaps.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ethical assessment. Keep exploring this topic and think critically about the role assessments play in your own life and in society as a whole.
It's the APA Ethics Code. Our source material dives into it, and it's fascinating how detailed it is.
So this code, it's like the rule book
Yeah.
that keeps psychologists on the right track ethically.
It lays out 6 core principles. They're the foundation.
6 principles.
Okay.
Can we break those down a little?
Yeah.
I'm curious how they work in real-life situations.
Absolutely. So the first one is competence. Psychologists got to stay within their area of expertise, and they need to constantly update their knowledge and skills. It's kind of like a doctor specializing in cardiology.
Right. You wouldn't want them doing brain surgery.
Exactly. And just like medicine, the field of psychology is constantly evolving. Staying current is crucial.
Makes sense. So competence is about knowing your stuff and keeping up with new developments. What's next?
Integrity. Being honest and transparent in all your work. No fudging the data or hiding unfavorable results.
That's good to hear. Integrity is essential for building trust, not just between the assessor and the person being assessed, but for the entire field.
Right. We need to be able to trust each other's work. And speaking of trust, another important principle is professional and scientific responsibility.
Okay, so this is about upholding those professional standards.
Exactly. It's about using evidence-based practices, staying up to date on research, being accountable for the quality of our work, taking our roles seriously, and contributing to the field.
It's like being a responsible representative of the profession.
Right. Now let's think about the individuals involved in assessments. The APA code emphasizes respect for people's rights and dignity.
It feels like that should be a fundamental principle for any profession.
It is. It's about recognizing the inherent worth of every individual, treating everyone with fairness and respect, and ensuring their rights are protected.
Okay, so respect for rights and dignity. It's about ensuring everyone is treated fairly.
Yeah.
What about their well-being? Does the code address that?
It does. The fifth principle is concern for others' welfare. It emphasizes acting in the best interest of our clients and minimizing any potential harm.
So it's a balancing act, the need for assessment and the potential impact on the person's well-being.
Exactly. We need to think about the benefits and risks and make sure we're not causing undue stress or harm. It's similar to a doctor weighing the benefits of a treatment against the potential side effects.
You don't want the treatment to be worse than the illness.
Right. And the final principle is social responsibility. It encourages psychologists to use their knowledge and skills for the greater good.
So using your skills to make a positive impact on the world.
That's it. It's about looking beyond the individual case and considering the broader impact of our work.
Wow, that's a comprehensive set of principles.
Hmm?
It's clear that the APA Ethics Code is all about doing things the right way.
Yeah.
But how do these principles actually work in practice? How do they translate into specific guidelines for assessments?
Well, the APA Ethics Code also has specific standards that cover different aspects of psychology, including assessment.
So it's like taking those broad principles and applying them to the details of how we actually do assessments.
Exactly. For instance, there's a whole section on evaluation, assessment, or intervention. It lays out clear expectations for doing assessments ethically.
What kind of expectations?
It covers things like using tests appropriately, being aware of their limitations, obtaining informed consent, maintaining confidentiality, and providing clear explanations of results. It's about making sure that the entire process is done ethically, fairly, and with respect for the individual.
Sounds like a roadmap for ethical assessment.
You could say that. And to show how seriously they take this, there are even more specific standards for educational and psychological tests.
Wow.
Yep. These standards go even deeper, covering everything from the technical quality of the tests to the ethical guidelines for using them in various settings.
It's like they're making absolutely sure that everything is done right. Okay? So we've laid the foundation, we've talked about the principles and the standards that guide ethical assessment. But now let's get down to brass tacks. What are some of the big ethical issues that come up when you're actually doing assessments?
That's a great question. Our source material highlights three main areas: informed consent, confidentiality, and invasion of privacy. These are areas where you really need to be careful.
Those are definitely some weighty topics.
Yeah.
Let's start with informed consent. What exactly does that mean in the context of assessments? It's more than just signing a form.
Right. It is. It's about making sure that the person being assessed really understands what they're agreeing to. They need to know the purpose of the assessment, how the results will be used, and any potential risks or benefits.
It's about transparency and letting them make an informed choice.
Exactly. And it can get a little complicated. Like,
Right.
what if an assessment reveals something unexpected, something the person wasn't prepared for? Or what about sharing results with employers or schools?
Those are tough situations.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. Informed consent is something you need to revisit throughout the whole process.
So it's not just a one-time thing. Okay? Informed consent is about making sure the person is fully informed. Now, what about confidentiality? That seems like a fundamental part of the relationship between the assessor and the client.
You're absolutely right. Confidentiality is essential. It creates a safe space where people feel comfortable sharing openly and honestly.
But are there ever any exceptions to that rule? Are there situations where you have to break confidentiality?
There are certain situations where psychologists are legally obligated to disclose information, things like child abuse, elder abuse, or threats of harm. In those cases, protecting people from harm takes priority.
It's like a safety valve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are also situations where clients consent to sharing information, like for insurance purposes or to get accommodations at school.
So even when sharing is necessary, you still have to be ethical about it.
Absolutely. You only share the minimum amount of information necessary.
Okay, so we've covered informed consent and confidentiality. Now let's move on to that third area, invasion of privacy. This seems like a particularly sensitive issue, especially in this digital age.
It is. We have to be very mindful of people's privacy.
I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
Imagine taking a personality test that reveals secrets you don't want anyone to know. That could feel like a huge violation.
It could. And that's why it's so important to be transparent. Our source talks about personality tests because some of those questions can get very personal.
Oh, yeah. They can get pretty deep.
So the assessor needs to explain why they're asking those questions and how the information will be used.
So how do you find that balance
Hmm.
between the need to get a complete picture during an assessment and respecting someone's right to privacy, especially in situations like hiring for a job?
It's a delicate balance. You have to be upfront about what you're measuring, obtain informed consent, and use the least intrusive methods possible.
So it's about gathering the information you need while still making sure the person feels respected and safe.
Exactly. We need to remember that the people we assess are not just data points. They're real people with their own lives and experiences.
It all comes back to treating people with dignity and respect, even when you're gathering information about them.
I agree. It's about recognizing the human element in everything we do.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's made me realize how complex and nuanced ethical assessment really is. It's so much more than just giving tests and interpreting scores.
It's about understanding the whole person.
Right, their background, their strengths, their challenges,
Yeah.
and approaching the whole process with sensitivity and respect.
Exactly. And understanding the potential impact.
And speaking of impact, we can't forget about the elephant in the room technology. It's transforming the world of assessment too.
It's a game changer.
What are your thoughts on the rise of online assessments and the use of AI?
It's an exciting time, but also a bit daunting. Online assessments have the potential to make things more accessible. People in remote areas can take them. More flexible scheduling. And AI can automate parts of the process, making it more efficient and potentially reducing human bias. But we need to be cautious.
What are some of the things we need to watch out for?
First, we need to make sure those online assessments are still high quality. Just because it's online doesn't mean it's a good test.
Does the standards have to be just as high?
Absolutely. And then there's data security. We're dealing with sensitive information. We have to make sure it's protected.
Especially with all the data breaches happening these days.
Exactly. And with AI, we need to be aware of the potential for algorithmic bias. AI systems learn from the data they're trained on. So if the data is biased, the AI will be biased too.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. We need to be thoughtful and deliberate. Prioritize fairness and accuracy. And always respect the individual.
It's about embracing the benefits of technology while also being aware of the risks.
That's a great way to put it.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper appreciation for the complexities of ethical assessment.
It's an important topic.
It is. But before we wrap things up, I'd like to shift gears a bit and ask you about the future of ethical assessment. What are some of the big trends and challenges that you see on the horizon?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be keeping up with technology. Things are changing so fast, new tools, new approaches. It can be hard to predict what the ethical implications will be.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. We need ethical guidelines that can adapt to these rapid changes.
It's like we need an ethical GPS for the future of assessment.
That's a great analogy. I think another challenge is going to be communication and collaboration. We need assessors, researchers, policymakers, and the people being assessed to all be on the same page.
So open dialogue is key.
Absolutely. We need to be willing to learn from each other and be flexible.
It sounds like the future of ethical assessment is all about being adaptable and staying engaged in the conversation.
It is. The stakes are high, and we all have a responsibility to do this right.
This deep dive has been so valuable. I feel like I have a much better grasp of what ethical assessment really means.
It's about more than just tests.
It's about the people.
Absolutely.
And before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about how technology is changing assessment. But what about the other way around? How are the ethical decisions we make in assessment shaping the way technology develops?
That's a really interesting question.
Think about AI and data collection. It's a two-way street. The choices we make today about how we collect and use data will have a huge impact on the future. It's a reminder that ethical considerations are important in all areas of our lives, not just in assessment.
That's a great point. Ethical thinking should be a part of everything we do.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of ethical assessment. Keep exploring this topic, and think critically about the role assessments play in your own life and in the world around you.
Yeah, it's not just about translating the words. You got to understand the nuances, the cultural context that shapes how people think and respond to those questions.
Right. So what might be a normal response in one culture could be totally different in another.
Exactly. That's where having specialized knowledge in cross-cultural assessment is so important. It's not just about being, culturally sensitive. It's about really understanding how culture influences everything.
So you need to use assessment tools that have been specifically adapted for the cultural group you're working with.
Absolutely. And if you don't, you risk misinterpreting the results. And that could actually be harmful.
So